Delighted you could stay with us for the afternoon. I mentioned earlier on, I think when Tony and Roddy were giving their year in review earlier on, that it's almost become a staple of IFI Spotlight. Well, I suppose if there's any other staple of Spotlight, it has become our panel on diversity and inclusion that we've been looking at for the last few years. I suppose it's such an important topic in the industry, but at society at large, and for us to look at D&I and something that we're constantly looking at in the IFI as well. It's interesting, even when you hear Sarah's comments earlier on about music composers and about those quite startling stats about female representation, that even though sometimes I think we feel that like there's been great work done and great strides, especially in relation to gender, but when you hear those kind of stats, it's sort of startling and brings it back, like, with a huge shock of how bad some of the stats still are. But one of the things I suppose we've really found over the last few years in particular with this panel is maybe a bit of a move. The conversation, I think, has grown as well, whereas in the very early days with Susan, we were very much looking at gender representation in the industry. And it's really evolved, and now we're sort of looking more at diversity and inclusion right across the broad spectrum. So it's really interesting to see that conversation develop, but then get that startling reality from Sarah earlier on of bringing it back home as well, of how maybe things aren't improving as much as we think they are, even though I think everyone acknowledges there have been improvements in the last few years. So with staples like Roddy and Tony earlier on, our other staple has become the wonderful Dr. Susan Liddy to host and chair this afternoon's session. Dr. Susan Liddy lectures in the Department of Media and Communication Studies in MIC University of Limerick. Her research interests relate primarily to gender and diversity issues in the Irish film industry, motherhood, and the representation of women over 40 on screen and behind the camera. She is the editor of Women in the Irish Film Industry, Stories and Storytellers, and Women in the International Film Industry, Policy, Practice and Power. She is co-editor of Media Work, Mothers and Motherhood, Negotiating the International Audiovisual Industry, and Susan has recently co-authored 2 reports, authoring Gender and Diversity Change in Irish Media Sectors for the BAI and the Pursuit of Change for Raising Films Ireland. She is the chair of Women in Film and Television Ireland and a board member of WIFT International, the Writers Guild of Ireland and Raising Films Ireland. Susan is also the director of Catalyst International Film Festival in Limerick, a festival that prioritises films and filmmakers from underrepresented groups. But most importantly, Susan has recently joined us on the board of the IFI. So I will allow Susan to introduce the rest of the panel and leave us in Susan's capable hands. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ross. I should say I'm about to really minimise the wonderful panel here by agreement, and I don't think that deal was that I was going to get a big spiel, but I forgot to tell you, Ross. So just very briefly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Clyde Nawanka, a lecturer in UCL UK. His research and expertise focuses on racial inequality and racism primarily. Aisha Bolaji is the co-founder of GLADPAL Collective. She's a creative director, visual artist, and an arts activist. She's also, importantly, a student of film at the moment. So, Aisha, you represent the future, which is wonderful. I'm delighted to see you here. We have Carmel Winters, playwright, screenwriter, and director. And we have finally Maureen Hughes, casting director, who has a cast, I think, about 40 feature films and 22 dramas. Did I read that right?
No, you aged
Sounds
me.
about right. She did all that in a very short window of time. Very quickly. So look, welcome all, and thank you so much. We're talking today about casting. I suppose a lot of the discussions I've had here have been about the industry, the writers, the directors. This casting is going back in a way to representation, which I think is important, maybe got slightly lost in the last couple of years. So I'd like to start by asking everybody really about representation. Why is representation important to you? What are the absences, the omissions, the distortions, whatever way you want to put it, that trouble you particularly, personally? Can we start with you, Clive?
Sure. Meant first for some reason. Okay. So, I mean, representation has always been central to my research, primarily looking at the film industry in the UK and beyond, with a particular interest in questions of racial and ethnic and cultural difference. Now, what's interested me today is discussions on various panels around Irish film culture and what constitutes that and what defines that. Now, within that question is also Irish identity per se. What constitutes Irish identity? And for me, representation, to think around race ethnicity, always remains a contested and fought over question. Who really constitutes Irish identity? And therefore, it means that what we see on screen, what we encounter, what we consume becomes an important signifier for the state of the nation. And that's always been the case with most contemporary historic cinema or any kind of visual culture. So thinking around how we understand the nation through the visual medium, through narrative, through particular themes as well, becomes an interesting entry point to understand who we are, who others think we are, how we negotiate those identities. So for that reason, representation is crucial. Now, what I think has been the shift in the last 22 years or so of diversity policy, so to say, has been this movement towards anti-racism as one particular faction. Now, of course, there's been other areas in the past. Gender has been a huge thing. There's a massive, massive way to go, but there's been conversations and some incremental change. However, with race, it's always accompanying a kind of conjunctural moment. So in the US, it was Trayvon Martin, and that opened up a conversation around race in America and then the film industry. George Floyd was the most recent one, which then became a question around structural racism. Now, what interests me is the way that diversity, which can be understood as the management of institutions of cultural and racial difference, has now become the nomenclature for thinking around anti-racism. Now, the difference I find is with diversity, it's possible to have a diversity agenda while still maintaining some racial structures very, very easily. Whereas anti-racism, I don't think can be commodified or industrialized in the same way. So what's disturbed me, I think, in that post-George Floyd conjuncture is the conflation of diversity with anti-racism. If there's more diversity in the film industry, there will be anti-racism. Whereas I would say diversity is actually the index of anti-racism. If there is anti-racism in terms of policy, legislation, what you'll see and feel organically is diversity in every sphere of society. So that goes back to thinking of how we must ensure that we don't decouple what happens in the film industry from any other sphere of society. So what happens in the film industry is a simple mirroring of what happens in another kind of sphere of cultural and social life. Now, what diversity does particularly well is splinter the industry from those social and cultural experiences. There's something particular about the industry that is instinctively anti-racist, instinctively non-sexist, for instance, which then puts it outside the purview of any kind of legal framework or legal discussion. So there are both pros to diversity as a policy, as an agenda, but also some very obvious lacunas that need to be discussed as well.
Okay, all right. Aisha, what are your thoughts on representation?
I think like looking at representation overall, like in the way we consume it in Ireland, we get like a lot of the views we'd get. I can only speak from the Black experience really.
Yes.
All the views we'd get on Black people comes from a very like African American sphere, and I know like the whole idea of like a Black and Irish identity is only becoming like fairly new to kind of Ireland, and that's kind of only becoming like more explored. And I think the way we explore it tends to kind of like focus in on like the trauma, and it tends to focus in on like the very like hyper racialized experience of it, rather than kind of the humane aspects of it, to like paraphrase myself, but I'm sure like there's a better way of saying that, but like kind of like seeing Black people as people who can just like experience life, and who can like experience joy, and who can like do things like they can, you know, like go have movies about like losing their dog and needing to go find them, or like they can like be like silly teenage girls who have like massive crushes.
Yes,
Just stuff like that, because I think like we're still in that frame where because we want to focus so much on educating ourselves, and like that is amazing, and I think that's so necessary, but it needs to also be in tandem with that humanization and not seeing it as a thing of like a moment of education rather than like a chance to tell a story.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
So I think like those things can like coexist with each other and be just as valuable, but I think at the moment like we tend to focus a lot on like the pain and trauma that comes with being like a person of color in Ireland at the moment. But I think like if there's almost like a better balance of it, we'll kind of get a better representation of And I think especially for like young Black and Irish people to see themselves,
Yes.
because like if they're only seeing themselves represented in these kind of like harsh traumatic stories, it's kind of like, okay, this is life for me, or like this isn't everything that's like that we can experience, or everything that we can like be. But at the moment I feel like that's kind of what's been happening, and like I kind of see why that trajectory went that way, because there was a lot of education that needed to happen, but we need to take a step back and be like, okay, like what's the difference between this movie and any other movie that you want to go see?
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's
All right.
kind of where I'm at with that.
Thanks,
Yes.
Aisha.
Really well said.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
That makes me think of the character in Young Offenders.
With Demi Isaac.
Yeah. And like, that's classically that. I mean, it's not a trauma or problem orientated narrative. She's not her identity isn't problematized. So I think you're spot on. And like the difficulty sometimes with single dramas like feature films is that by their nature being drama, they are problem orientated. So we look for the problem in the human being that needs to be solved. And I think it's just lazy though if we go for like, it's kind of the opposite of empowering if every time you feature only through the lens of what the white gaze finds exotic, or the straight gaze finds exotic, whatever it is. So yeah, I really, really chime with what you're saying, Aisha. But for myself, I suppose, in terms of representation, that's the art form I'm involved in. Like, that is the art. It's where the art and the politic come together, is in the representation. It's the most potent human act. Now, if you in a social situation take up a mirror and hold it to the other people in the social situation, it's probably the most threatening, dangerous thing you can do in an interaction, is hold up a mirror. Like, and I'm one of 12 children, I know very well this is true. Like, one time I remember, like, this just occurred to me this minute, like my first cousin was over from the States, and she was telling a story, and all, there were about 16 of us just around the table, and it got very animated, and everybody was talking over each other, kind of symphony of voices. And my first cousin, grabbed in a friendly gesture, grabbed my brother's hand across the table and bit his knuckles and drew blood. And like, it was a classic family interaction. And I was looking at this going like, because I'm always thinking, drama rarely attains the pure poetry of real life. Real life is just so incredibly interesting in its ratio of form to chaos, and the kind of, what really goes down. So I had the notion anyway that I'd record this. I popped my phone, on the table and let it record. And I'll never forget the next day the sense of betrayal when I said, hey, listen to this. So what I'm getting at is, not for 1 minute do I imagine that the business of representation isn't dangerous, or that it is neutral, and that there's this, wonderfully objective role you pop into. And like, to me, it's like, it's just rigged with landmines, the terrain. I'm so aware of it. I'm probably like, and say for instance, and I think there's something kind of to be, what occurred to me when I thought of this conversation was, I remember years ago when there were very few representations of lesbians on screen. And the Wachowski brothers made the thriller Bound. And they're now the Wachowski sisters. They've both transitioned from male to female. But every lesbian, so the two main lesbian characters were played by straight actors. And every lesbian I knew relished that movie, and we still relish it to this day. Because what they did was they went out to this sexpert. This Susie Bright was an S&M kind of lesbian advocate. And they went to her for advice on how to do the sex scene. And they achieved characterizations and representations and the sex scene that is now like famous among lesbians. They achieved so much with that. And I was like, why was that so successful? It was because they recognized our desire, not our reality. So people really get confused around authenticity, credibility. It's like, no, what they responded to was how lesbians wanted to see themselves, not how we are. Because around the same time, Rose Trush made this film where she cast actual lesbians. She herself was a lesbian.
Mhm.
It was really it was really gritty. And the critics loved it. And the lesbians were like, that was fucking boring. Because it didn't tie in with our aspirations.
Okay,
And,
yeah, no, yeah.
you know what I mean?
I do.
But now, years later, I said, I'm truly corrupted now in my sensibility. Because now I really like that film and I really rate it. But I'm aware that what's at stake. There's so much at stake from the point of view of like all the different audiences. But, you know, within one film, what I'm trying to do is always operate like in the act of magicianship, working through my biography, but not from my biography. If I'm working well, I have to have access to more than what I currently know when I'm just in my own everyday self. When you're working well, you have access to more. And you're always looking for access to more. But say, for instance, if I did a film like Float Like a Butterfly, which was Maureen was hugely involved in some of the really naughty, you know, the casting. Like within that, I know I'm stepping into, Christ, this is dangerous. This is really riddled with pitfalls. I know also I'm working in the area of, you know, every Irish person's experience of either being the shadow or projecting their shadow. So, but I have to trust that in my attraction, I find myself a trustworthy human being when it comes to difference of any kind, because I think I've enough of a love of humanity coupled with justice to be led by the right reasons. But there's a process then of checking that along the way.
Yeah, and we will come to that, and that's a good point. Maureen, what about you, representation? What are your thoughts? Is it important to you? What are the gaps that you, like I should say, but we're all tuned to see certain gaps, I suppose, more, aren't we, some than others? I mean, that's why my focus would be, I'm looking and I'm going, where are the women 40 plus and beyond and beyond and beyond? Because, you know, that's what I see missing. It's not that I don't register that there are other absences, but maybe we all have certain buttons that
my buttons are unusual in a way for an Irish casting director, in that my partner is an African American, and so I've got a mixed race child of 17 years of age. And on Eric's arrival into this country in 2002, one of the first questions he asked me as soon as he arrived in the city, and he looked at me and said, "Where are the brothers?" I went, "Gosh, I didn't even know what he was talking about. Where are the brothers?" I went, "There are no brothers." Or there are maybe 100, and they're spread all over the country, and maybe soon you'll see one or two, and eventually he did. But I remember from that moment onwards being very guided by Eric in a way. At the time, I was casting, and I still do, for film and theatre and television, and so I feel I've got a real responsibility to really looking at the question of representation and making sure that I'm on top of it. And I'm not always. I'm a human being. I'm totally flawed as well. But I find with Eric, what I need to do most is listen. I need to listen. I work a lot with the travelling community. And about 5 years ago, I was really, really lucky to be gifted the task of working on a pretty interesting project, which was set in direct provision, which wasn't an area of this Ireland I knew that well, other than that it is that kind of thing we all know lies out there, but do we really, really know what goes on there? So because I had to kind of really investigate it, I had to go out there and try and cast from it. So I came across this extraordinary people who were kind of locked away in this kind of archaic kind of system, and was quite shocked by it, and found some extraordinary young black actors. And so I became aware over the 20 years since Eric has arrived here, and I mark everything by Eric's arrival in a way for me, because it was the beginning of the new Ireland. It was the beginning of an Ireland that up until then hadn't existed in my optics. It's not to say it didn't exist, but in my optics it hadn't existed. And suddenly I'm living with an African American who's coming with a very, very different history to mine. His surname, for instance, is the name of a slave owner. He doesn't own his own name, and that was a big discussion for us when he arrived, because interestingly, I come from the west of Ireland, where the name Gill is in, it's 30% of the names in Connemara are Gill, and that's Eric's surname, or it's the surname he's inherited. And so I've been lucky in a way to live with him, and also to watch a mixed race child grow up who is, because she's a daddy's girl, she's black in first position. She goes to school pretending she's Angela Davis. She's shocked when nobody in the school knows who Angela Davis is.
Right.
She's bald.
Yeah.
She's obsessed with the Black Panther movement.
Right.
She can't wait to get back to America because that's where she feels she needs to. She feels in some strange way that she won't actually be whole until she immerses herself in that area of her life.
Yeah.
And so her whiteness is almost a slight embarrassment. Or I sometimes go, but your aunties are lovely down in Galway, Ruby. And she goes, yeah, but the ones in America are better. They're not actually, they're the same. So I've been very conscious in casting how difficult this has been. I'm also conscious that when we started out casting Black actors and Asian actors, and soon I hope we'll be casting lots of Northern European actors. There's a lot of very good Ukrainian actors who've come into the country. But initially when we started, I hated the fact that we were casting them in token roles because we had to fucking tick a box, which I really, really despise. I thought, actually, don't ask me to tick a box. Ask me to cast this and be reflective of a community, and that community has a percentage of, there are people who live in the community that I live in Cabra, who are both Irish, white, Black American, Black African, Ukrainian, Russian, Chinese, Brazilian. We have the new Ireland is a hot pot of culture. It's not just one; it's a hot pot, and it's the most exciting thing that's happened in this country ever, I think. And I think if we're really, really conscious about making representation, to represent it, we need to listen to these communities and find out what it is they need from us.
Okay, right, yeah. Clyde, there's a lot of talk. Well, I'll link two questions. I'm conscious that that I don't have a watch here, so keep me posted, will you, lads? What time is it now? It's 5 to 3. So, Clyde, there's a lot of talk about colourblind casting. So this was kind of brought to the fore. There was so much talk about Bridgerton and what they had done, and I'm just using that as an example of like this big discussion. And then there's a difference between colourblind casting and colour conscious casting, and some are saying colourblind casting is actually erasing altogether race. It's pretending I know there's a variety of thoughts on it, but that you're planting Black people into white narratives, and that isn't particularly useful either. I mean, I suppose you could look at it. Some would say, okay, but it's great that actors, ethnic actors from ethnic minorities are getting a bit of a chance to shine. But then there's others going, but what's the point if you're erasing everything about them? What are your thoughts on some of those arguments?
Well, welcome to the wonderful world of the politics of diversity, where you can't satisfy everyone's needs. And that's what we've been trying to grapple with the last kind of 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, in my own opinion, I think the idea of colourblind casting and colour-conscious casting are one and the same. They're both within the same orbit, which is diversity in casting itself. And the reason they unify is because they're both concerned with the same phenomena. On the one hand, is trying to ensure that there is representation of Black and minority people in film in a very, very natural way. The other concern is ensuring that representation is reflective of the society within which it's born. So those are the two primary concerns of colourblind casting or colour-conscious casting. Now, what interests me is that neither are immaterial, in the sense that whether it's colour consciousness or colourblind, it is still always concerned and spectacularizing difference. And what I found interesting with your point there is you're talking about the everyday, the diurnal, the unspectacular. Let's see someone driving a car or falling in love or walking a dog or drinking for a month as a test or something. And that's where any ambition for colourblind casting or colour conscious is going at. Let's make these representations unspectacular, everyday, diurnal, natural, organic, and that is your representation of a very, very modern and unified UK or Ireland or beyond. Now, colourblind casting can never get there because it's so concerned with the spectacular, be it Bridgerton or Dev Patel in David Copperfield. Look at the wonderful things we're kind of doing.
Yes.
And now, does that speak to the needs of the actors or actresses or the audience as well, which is never really featured in these discussions? The audience, how do they see these things? So I think colourblind casting as a kind of nomenclature or a language is interesting and may produce some incremental changes. But who's it really benefit? Does it benefit Netflix celebrating one of the things they're kind of doing? Does it actually benefit the actor involved? Because when I say the immaterial, for me, it seems like it's impossible for the actor or actress to be non-symmetrical in the sense that their cultural identity becomes material to their on-screen identity or not. And in that situation, I think it's very, very hard to approach colorblind casting as one example, as not being embedded in that larger diversity project of how do we make some incremental structural change at the surface level without dismantling the real structures underneath. And this idea of the spectacular, the unspectacular becomes quite important here. What kind of themes and narratives can we create that go beyond colorblind casting or color conscious casting that makes representation of difference unspectacular day and night, every day? I don't think either of those descriptions really get to that point.
Yeah. So there was also a lot of last year, I think 2021. There was also a lot of discussion around Anne Boleyn for Channel 5 and Jodie Turner-Smith's first black Anne Boleyn. So you didn't join in the celebrations, did you, of that, or did you? How did you react to that?
I mean, I'm a bit long in the tooth for the research, so I kind of see where it's kind of going. And listen, I mean, it goes back to what representation you made at the beginning. It's important to people. I think excess always comes from a space of lack in all things. So I think the excessivity of our celebration and representation comes from a very, very long and deep history of lack and absence. So it's inevitable, undeniable, acceptable that this kind of hyper celebration kind of this will take place when we see this or Death Patel or someone else. And I don't think the ambition should be to try and suppress that. But I think the kind of counter ambition should be, can we get to a situation or space or a moment where we haven't got to celebrate this all the time? Except as, again, diurnal, everyday, unspectacular. And I don't think the diversity industry allows that because it's so kind of based on celebration, on discourse, on massification to sustain the industry of diversity itself, that making things unspectacular don't really speak to the kind of, dare I say, economic needs of diversity as well.
Okay. What do you think, Aisha? Do you get a sense of joy when you see, black actors cast in non-traditional ways?
I think like definitely like because I was definitely a kid who was like a sucker for like seeing anyone black on screen.
Were you?
Yeah, like I was like because I remember like the Cinderella I grew up on was like Brandy Cinderella with like Whitney Houston. So that was a Brandy and Whitney Houston. And like that was like Cinderella to me. It wasn't like the Disney cartoon one where like she was like white with blonde hair and blue eyes like, and like I know for me like growing up my mom like put a special emphasis on like making sure I was watching things that like and like it's almost like it's like I know like a lot of like black people say like sometimes they might have even went like backwards in terms of like representation on screen sometimes when you look at like the 90s sitcoms that came out. Remember like the kind of like golden era of like Fresh Prince and like the Cosby Show and like Family Matters, Girlfriends, like that's what my mom had me watching. And like but then I got to like secondary school and stuff and I was like, oh, like nobody else is watching all this. And then like it dawned on me. I was like, I was like, okay, we're not really here. We're not. But like, yeah, I think like definitely like I still get excited seeing black people on screen. Like I 100% still get excited, especially like in the Irish landscape and even kind of being within that creative community because it is like very small. But it's kind of like a case of like you're celebrating your friends and you're celebrating their achievements. And like I think even like I think like even one time like this was like it was like Love Island last year, and like there was this Vodafone ad, and like she was only in it for like 5 seconds, but it was this girl and she was like in it for 5 seconds. She was black, and like all my friends were texting me like, oh my gosh, do you see that black girl called Orla on TV? And like she's in a Vodafone ad for 5 seconds.
Wonderful and also sad.
Because then I started, and it's because she was just playing like I think this guy's girlfriend in the lighthouse and stuff, and we were all so excited that I was like, oh my god, guys, this is actually kind of depressing. We were like latching onto it because I was like I think that was like one of the most like positive kind of things that we had seen that was kind of structured that way, and that kind of like that like opened my eyes a bit into like kind of seeing like, okay, what kind of stories do I want to tell in the future, or kind of like what sort of things do I want to say, because like clearly like this is what excites me, 5 seconds of a Vodafone ad, but like it's kind of like that sort of thing where like even I remember watching Sing Street when I was younger, and I know like Jafaris was in that, and like he played the guy who's playing the keyboard for the band in Sing Street, and he had like one line, and I remember like being like 16. I was like, "Film there, there's a black person in film," because like I just needed 5 seconds just because I was like, "Oh, just so it's not me," and it's just really really depressing. But it's also kind of like you just have to latch onto it and just be like, "Okay, like this means like things are changing slowly but surely." But like
and there's a place for you there.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like there's like somebody's there and you can like join them, and it can be like a big. I don't know, you'll be able to like sustain yourself and like it'll be exciting and new. But yeah, like I definitely think that like I get super excited, like, and I love Bridgerton, and like I love like I'm a massive Bridgerton fan. And,
So
like,
you didn't do the analysis, we'll say, in terms of why are they in there. You just got pleasure from seeing.
Yeah, because I think like it's that sort of thing where kind of like you gotta just like go to that thing. You go to your point of celebration.
Yeah. Okay.
But like it's definitely also that other point of kind of like, oh, like we can also exist as our like authentic selves. And I say authentic loosely because like it's kind of.
I know.
But like we can exist as we are in like normal circumstances, or like that thing of like if we are gonna like exist within the spectacular and like sci-fi and fantasy are right there. But
yeah.
they don't want to see us there. I don't know why, but like it's right there, and I'm like it's like a free for all. But it's that thing of like you want to see Black people just like be like, whether it be like morally good or morally bad characters, but you want that diversity within that representation of who they can be. And I think that's the most important thing, that there's always going to be that like broad range of who they can play and like who they can represent themselves as. Because I feel like sometimes at the moment, like if like at the moment there's that sort of like thing of being like a token that you don't want to, a lot of people might be scared to write like morally like bad Black characters because that means that they're like representing the Black community in like a negative light. But I think it's also like, okay, we need to get past the point where one person represents the whole community.
Yes. And Aisha, I could listen to you all day. I mean, really. But can I ask you in passing, because this has to be quick, are you energized by the different initiatives to bring emerging diverse voices through? I mean, I know we not some of them, we go, there's not enough, you could do more, blah, blah, blah. But does it personally give you hope?
Yeah, definitely, because it's a starting point. I think it's definitely a starting point. And I think like a big thing when I talk to like other artists of color or that sort of thing, when they do kind of like go to these like diversity schemes and like all these different kind of like trainings and seminars, they're always wondering like, well, if all the diverse people are in this room, where's everybody else? Like where's everybody else? Like what are they doing? And like it's very like separated almost. So it's kind of like you have everyone who's kind of like in a marginalized community like working together, and it's kind of not been, that moment of integration isn't like fully there yet. And I know it's kind of like getting there slowly, but I think it's definitely exciting that kind of like they've seen that there's a need for them, like more diversity in Ireland and in the industry. So yeah, I think it's exciting, but like still has like more steps to go. Yeah.
Thanks, Aisha. I can see now that I've got to kind of, I have all my notes. I thought, the way you think it's going to go a certain way, and then can I broaden it out to believability and authenticity? Because these are things that come up. Things like for instance, your man who wrote Downton, Julian Fellows, when he was challenged, where the diverse characters, where he was able to say, well, it wouldn't be believable to write those in this particular, narrative. It wouldn't have been credible, believable. The other thing is authenticity, which is like, is it okay if the script says somebody's in a wheelchair? Is it okay to have an actor in a wheelchair? Now, you can bring any of these issues because they're all, you don't have to stick with that example, but is that okay? I mean, where's the line? Eddie Redmayne playing Stephen Hawking. Was that okay?
Well, I did a play called B for Baby in the Abbey one time, right? And there were 4 characters played by 2 actors. And 2 of the characters had intellectual disabilities. And there was a debate on whether and neither of the 2 actors had any intellectual disability playing the 4 characters. And it was a debate. Now, if you were a maker, if you were a director or writer, you would absolutely know that if the play was to function within the conceit that it was designed, or that prompted it, there was no way the 2 actors with intellectual disabilities could play those roles. Now, actually, only one of those 2 characters actually, as a character, had an intellectual disability. But the guy who played the part, his sister has Down syndrome.
Okay.
And he's been playing Down since he was a child with his sister. He's so influenced by her. His body language is so influenced by her. he had a legitimate route to play that. I would say he would say that play would not be put on today for all the wrong reasons, not
Okay.
the right reasons. It would not be put on today,
Mm.
because it couldn't possibly be but I think more if you're lazy. So there's an actor, say for instance, who's paralyzed from the bra strap down, and who's a great actor, and a role comes along where somebody is paralyzed, right? And they are paralyzed and they don't have to do anything that they can't do, and that actor is overlooked. You go, what the fuck happened there? But if it happens that that role has absolutely nothing in common with their human qualities as a person, like this is really like I go, right, there's an argument then for why you can cast them, or maybe you know what I mean, like it's on. I think people outside the making, the nuts and bolts making, sometimes come up with ideas or notions of what's possible that are actually complete nonsense to be blunt about it. Total nonsense. They don't have a clue.
What do you think, Maureen?
Yeah, I suppose as a casting director, you work on instinct all the time. There's no university degree. There's no, there's no rigors through which you go to become a casting director. You're known for your instinct and your taste. Yeah. And for me, the very basic instinct in casting is to cast the best actor, to cast the best person who serves the role. So do I know for certain that if Jim Sheridan were to make My Left Foot today, that he would want to cast Daniel Day-Lewis? Of course he would. Would he be right to cast him? Yes, he bloody would.
So
that
you
would
don't,
be my instinct.
yeah, so you're
I
saying,
don't.
because that's Kate Blanchett's line.
I think it's an actor,
yeah.
the very notion of the actor is someone who creates somebody outside of themselves. They're technically skilled to create another person. That's what they train for, that is what they do. And so I think we can become very neurotic and say, oh, no, we can only do this. And I was involved in a kind of a row about 5 years ago, just before COVID, actually. COVID kind of closed it down. But I was casting a production of Breakfast from Pluto, which is a piece written by Patrick McCabe, which has become a musical. It's written about a character called Paddy Pussy Braden from somewhere in County Monaghan, circa 1970. In 1970, in Monaghan, we did not have transgender people. We just didn't. That is not what this was about. He was a boy who liked to dress up as a girl. He was, in many ways, he was a transvestite. And we looked at both actors, straight, gay. We looked at everybody, including actors who were trans actors. And we were reported to Equity for casting someone who wasn't trans, wasn't a trans actor, despite the fact we had seen them. But they had to be three things. They had to sound like they were from County Monaghan, to be believable. They had to be amazing singers, and they had to be really good actors. And so we did go through a really protracted process, and we chose, and I still believe we chose the right actor, which was a young gay actor from Belfast called Frafi. He was a very big musical star. The production was closed down almost before it opened because of the reaction to it. And I remember feeling, oh my God, we've gone so far in the other direction that it doesn't make sense now.
Okay,
there's a better
Clyde
remedy.
is wanting to come in just for 1 second.
Yeah.
Did you want
Just
to...
very, very quickly, I mean, I completely concur with what you're saying, Maureen. I mean, so you mentioned Kate Blanchett there.
Yeah.
She played Bob Dylan, and she was amazing, I
Yeah.
thought, as well. So Eddie Raymond plays Dawkins. Now, are there disabled and neurodiverse actors who could play that role? Absolutely. Do you know them? No. And the reason being is because the whole model of the film industry, be it in Ireland or the UK or globally, is based on economic principle, which is stardom. And that's all it is. He played Dawkins because he was a star.
Yeah, he was, yeah.
And that connects everything that we're discussing and
Why
how we
is
are.
he a star? He's a star because he's a bloody great actor. As
But
well.
there's
But
opportunity.
here's a practical thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, there are better remedies than, okay, so the person, why not cast the person in the wheelchair in the part that no one ever thought of for a disabled actor? The part that was just a high fly, say, a particular lawyer, and actually the role becomes way more interesting when you add that to it, rather than, I think the worst route to go down is that you must be what you're playing. But equally, but you absolutely, that does not let you off the hook. It means that I'd like to see us write white in front of characters instead of black. or right. You know what I mean? Like, I think we got to name the so-called norm needs to be the thing that's interrogating itself and opening itself up to being cast differently. You know what I mean? Like, that's where the really exciting things happen. Because I know, even from working with, like, you know, writers who don't think outside the box, I'd read their script and go, now if you cast X, and they go like, well the character isn't black, and I say, like, but it becomes way more interesting. It becomes way more interesting when you think beyond your own biography. You know what I mean? And we should have access to that, just imaginatively.
Yeah, I'm just thinking here, like Helen Mirren playing Goldmeier and Maureen Lipman saying that is a wrong choice because Jewishness is part of the DNA of that, you know, Israeli prime minister. She should never have been cast. And then you've other actors different. You know, you've got Olivia Spencer has spoke about the offensiveness, the offensive, the kind of blow to humanity, if you like, to actually ignore people who and have others in who are pretending to be like them. Now you could argue, I mean, acting is all about pretense, but there are disabled actors saying, well, we can't even get to the auditions. There are actually physical problems getting there, but that doesn't mean we're not there. But for you, Maury, and you're probably best placed to kind of talk about these elements.
I would like to think that I would, if I had a role for a disabled actor, that I would absolutely look at a disabled actor as the first position. But what I'm saying is I don't want it to be imposed that we can only cast because they may not be as good as a Daniel Day-Lewis, who's also interested in playing the role. I think acting like, I'm delighted at the moment, for instance, that Ruth Negga is playing Lady Macbeth. Yes. And I think it's a complete colourblind casting because if somebody sat down and said, we want to cast a Macbeth for Broadway, Ruth Negga would be one of the first people that would come to my mind because she's got that kind of brittle, shrill, slightly neurotic rage running.
And she's done Hamlet.
Absolutely. She's absolutely right to play Lady Macbeth. Yeah. I didn't question whether she was mixed race or black or white. I just saw Ruth Negga, incredible actress. What a great Lady Macbeth. Would love to see it. Should be amazing. I sometimes.
But are we back to stardom then?
We're
because
back
Ruth
into
Negga
boxes.
is a star.
Yeah, that's
she is a star, but she's also a genius actress. I've watched her from the minute she left college. I have watched her run 50 miles ahead of every other graduate in her class because she was extraordinary. She had an extraordinary talent. It wasn't that she was black. It wasn't that she was mixed race. It was because she was extraordinary. And she became a star because she was extraordinary.
But the point I was making, was just the economic system. We're very, very quick. There are producers in the room now. And you secure and invest tremendous amounts in a film. And you want some kind of economic return, particularly in the Hollywood model. Now, you're not going to kind of hire the devil actor no one knows. You'll hire Eddie Raymond. So it's an issue that I critique, and I think all diversity is negated by the economic system. It has to be. It's unfortunate. It's a massive problem, but we will never dismantle the economic system of the global film industry, which means there will always be these kind of inequalities that need to try and negotiate through some kind of competing equilibrium. I think that's one of the kind of outcomes.
Yeah, I think until the disabled actor is the star. Is the star. Why can't
but unless the disabled actor gets the chance, that disabled actor will never be a star.
You know, at the end of the day, though, the economic determines everything. It's like actually the producer, the director, the finance will be conditional upon that star casting. So therefore, who really has the power in the casting? Who really is doing the casting?
Well, exactly. But, you know, to go back to the question of the Ruth Neggas, we have to find more Ruth Neggas.
We do.
We have to find more Chewy IORs. We have to find, we have to make sure we're here. I need to make sure that I'm in the place I'm meant to be, which is by the door that they need opened for them to get through, to get their next role, to get, I watched Ruth Negga come up. I cast her as Peggy and Mike in a very colour-blind production of Playboy of the Western World, which Guy Hans directed back in 1995. We didn't even question it. She was the best actress. She was going to be the most amazing Peggy, and she toured all over Australia.
And there was no concern, Maureen.
Nobody turned a blind eye. This was in 1995. But she was already the best young actress coming out of the traps in this country. She was like out there. There was nobody to touch her.
So, I mean, coming back, we're all agreed that so we need more diverse people in production, like if we put it like that. And as Aisha said, you need to see that you are there. So we're back to behind the camera a bit, aren't we? And we need people behind the camera who are going to make those changes. And yes, indeed,
oh my God, here she is.
Yeah. But kind of power does a casting director have, Maureen, in the sense that are you given a brief?
I get the script.
Yeah.
The producer rings me and goes, "Who are we going to get for the lead role?" So you put through, or a script comes in and there's already someone attached. Like, for instance, I've just cast a thing called America Club, and there are 3 actors attached by the time it arrived at my door. Which, and so it's Dame Maggie Smith, Laura Linney, and Kathy Bates playing 3 women I might add from Sheriff Street who go to Lourdes looking for a cure.
That I must see.
How diverse is that casting? That you must see. But usually, so sometimes it arrives. Do I have the power to call the casting? No. But if I have a good relationship with the director, I have the power to say, would you think of such and such a person? Or I would put somebody in front of you that you hadn't thought of. Or I would say, will you meet such and such a person? Because I've got an idea about them. I have the power to open the door, I suppose. But I don't make the decision. Ultimately, the decision will be made by the director and the producer. But I do have a responsibility to open the door for people.
Yeah.
That's where it's.
How are we doing on time, guys?
Maybe take some audience questions.
Oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, okay, fine. Anybody have anything to ask? Say, Tony.
I'd like to ask a question. Thank you very much. I found that very, very enlightening. And I was sort of really spurred by Aisha's contribution, which sent me back to Clive's contribution, really. And I was thinking about after Oscar So White, you know, I kind of and my colleague, I teach film in a university, and film studies, and we were kind of thinking, you know, we need to make sure race is absolutely part of our syllabus now. Why did we not do that before now? You know, so that's well and good, and off we went. And then COVID hit, and we couldn't get access. We couldn't screen film, so we had to send everybody to Netflix during that time. And of course, everybody for that class wrote about passing. Right. And I was all on board with that. You know, I thought that was great. This was really progressive, and this amazing performance by an Irish actor and all those kinds of things. And then as time went by, I started getting really annoyed with this. And I started getting really kind of disturbed by that film, actually. And I was disturbed by it because I kind of felt that Ruth's career in the amount that I was able to keep up with, which is not screened, stage-based, because I live in Galway, was sort of always seemed to be about race, like in a sense that her characters were in race-themed kind of stories. And I realized that I'd made this mistake, that I had kind of confused the question of race with the theme of race, if you see what I'm trying to say. And I realized that there's a line from a scholar, and I don't remember which one, is that every time we talk about race, we unrace the white character. And as Aisha said, which I thought was so amazing what you said, the first thing you said there was, you know, if we constantly talk about race, and particularly blackness, in only these terms, then we perpetuate a kind of a set of racial associations. And I said, okay, I don't want Passing to be the film that you watch, actually, now. Important and all though that story is, I think we need to do something else with it. So I just sort of wanted to put that out there. It was about that. How do we teach race? You know, and is it a kind of a dangerous thing to kind of look at films that centralize on that problem of blackness, actually, as it is, and particularly Netflix does a lot of this kind of filmmaking, it seems to me, while at the same time including race as a category for discussion in themes of representation. I hope that makes sense.
Respond to that?
I'll try my best. I think it's a very interesting but quite complicated question. Passing is actually like a film that a lot of my students who are doing work around mixedness watch and discuss and approach in their essays as well. And it's a complicated film. I remember being in the premiere in Curzon Mayfair, of all places. And whilst I appreciated the film, I was one of very, very few black people in the audience. And it was a big audience. I think that's quite important to mention that, because I think the film circulation, how it's consumed, the audience is important in the text itself, in terms of finding meaning to the film. In terms of the approaches, one thing you mentioned, which is quite important, is the centrality of whiteness as an invisible centrality. It's never really kind of mentioned.
Yeah.
It's a structural axis upon other identities and races are kind of consumed, discussed as well. So when I'm approaching the teaching of Black film or Black literature, it's always in a conversation with whiteness as well. I think it has to be as a comparative phenomenon. So even with kind of passing, okay, well, where is whiteness in here? What is whiteness kind of doing? How does whiteness make Blackness much more visible and, as you mentioned, problematic as well? So I think if it's done that context, in terms of problematizing whiteness through analysis of Blackness historically, I think that's important. I think it's once Blackness is analyzed as a silo, as removed from other kind of forms of kind of race or racialization or categorization, it then becomes problematic, it becomes distinctive, it becomes sidelined and marginalized. It's made particular as a particular problem. And I think there's a legacy of the academic study and teaching of Black film, or other kinds of minority film as well, that have done that have made the racial difference as peculiar and exoticized and fetishized as well. And that's an outcome of the things you're describing as well.
Yeah, it goes back to like you want to see panels on, you want to see men on male filmmakers talking about their maleness, white filmmakers having to review their whiteness. It really is about that. Like it's like that there's no, like that somehow if the panel is about diversity, that means Black, queer, disabled, like it's fucking ridiculous. That's just, it actually never gets to the point where you actually realize if you're the building blocks of the form that you work in is identity, you come with a big bag. And it's not to say that anyone has more Browning points than the other, but that like no one's neutral.
Yeah.
No one's neutral. It's just not a play. It doesn't exist. But oddly, we're kind of going more and more down the line of like, even the word color blind, color consciousness is like white doesn't have a color. It's just insane. Like it's just.
Anybody else? Yeah, Roddy?
Actually, I mean, I don't really want to derail that because I think that's really interesting, but and I don't want to turn this into a Ruth Nega kind of session either. But just on Ruth Nega.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Like the Black actress in Ireland, right? Ethiopian Irish. And so Tony and I wrote a book about just a dictionary of Irish cinema, and we did the second edition, but we did the first edition. We struggled to find actresses at all to put into that book. When we came to the second edition, it was like, thank Christ, Saoirse Ronan, Ruth Nega. We've got three now, because we've got Maureen O'Hara as well, right? But what struck me as kind of interesting, certainly was interesting about Ruth Nega's career in Irish film, was a kind of colour blindness to it. I'm thinking of things like Isolation, I'm thinking about Breakfast on Pluto, I'm thinking about Love, Hate, where her ethnicity isn't, I mean, as soon as she comes on screen, there's probably a moment for a predominantly kind of Caucasian Irish audience where they can go exotic for a second, and then it's just kind of gone, right? Then she leaves Irish cinema and she does Loving, she does Passing. And ironically, it's precisely the cinema you would have thought where her ethnicity was less interesting, less likely to draw attention, that it's focused on in her roles, because there her blackness is vital to those roles. And that's actually that's the extent of my comment on it.
And I suppose it comes back to what I think is that she's an extraordinary actress. I thought, why did she get cast in Loving in a huge country like America? And I think this is a very interesting point about English and Irish actors, in particular actors of colour. I'm always amazed. I remember watching The Wire back in the early 90s and being absolutely shocked at the amount of English actors who were playing the black roles in America. And I was giving a talk in Berkeley University, and it was to a drama class. And I looked at them and I said, my God, guys, you must be really pissed off. All these English actors coming out. I didn't even know what The Wire was. Back in Ireland. And I think in first position, Ruth Nega is a wonderful actress in the way that I see Daniel Day-Lewis. I think it has nothing to do, not that it has nothing to do, of course it has everything to do with, it is what has built her as an actress, but I think in first position, Ruth Nega is an extraordinary actress.
I also think audiences love transformation.
Yeah.
And the art of transformation, that's magic. So really, even when you mentioned about Tom Vaughan Lawler, because we haven't mentioned class at all.
No, we
And
haven't.
class
Yeah,
is the biggest beast in every room because that's power. Power.
Yeah.
Power. And, you know, I have been at film festivals where, like, you know, I have met, you know, filmmakers that, like, I think it's very uncomfortable for them being pushed into some, you know, like, oh, you're disadvantaged, and they're practically royalty. They're actually coming from, you know, extreme social privilege, and, like, you know, they're not comfortable themselves that oh, you're black, therefore you're disadvantaged. Quite the opposite, you know what I mean, in terms of cultural collateral, social capital. But in terms of audiences don't want to see a thing play itself again and again over time. They want to see the actor. When you cast Tom Vaughan Lawler, a middle class actor, it wasn't accidental that the middle class actor was so successful with the public for playing a working class character. There's something, we smell transformation and we love it. We love it. And I think for me, just to kind of catch on earlier, David Copperfield, I actually thought Dev Patel was great casting because he has the magician about him. He's like, and like, that's great casting. Do you know what I mean?
Talking about class there, and of course we could have talked about class, but disability doesn't get as much of a look in.
No.
And I think, you know, this whole talk about disability drag, you know what I mean, get someone in and put them in a wheelchair and that's them. So I thought it deserved that. But it was very interesting. At a recent event I was involved in, Lynn Ruan talked about working class and her own daughter's, you know, evolution into an actress, and she talked about that you can't put a casting session on and expect working class people that she knew to go along to it. That really there's got to be different ways of doing it, because there's you know, there are very particular disadvantages, which mean you need to come to them. So it was really actually very eye-opening to talk to Lynn Ruan. She had a marvelous insight into all of that, and we could have had the whole panel talking about cast. One more maybe. Anybody else, or are we done? We done? Yes, Rory.
Actually, yeah, I'd like to ask a question to Maureen. So, something that's come up just in my own work, because the previous project I worked on in Germany involved a lot of refugee characters and all that. And a lot of it required us actually going out into the community to find people who were interested in roles and things like that. I suppose it goes back to the class thing, like, what efforts do you feel casting directors are taking on to reach out to, let's say, you know, black actors who might not know the way to typically approach casting directors? What kind of methods do you use to try and reach out there?
It's a really good question, because I had to do it when I did Taken Down, actually. And so I literally went to the direct provision centres. I went into them. You kind of have, I think it goes back to what Susan was saying about Lynn, and how you have to go into communities like Sheriff Street if you want to get a kid, because they're not going to come across to the IFI or some fancy boutique studio in Ringsend. They're just not going to turn up. I'm not sure why. It probably has to do with something like class or something. But in the instance of looking for black actors, I went into direct provision. You go into the schools. You go into, in terms of when they're coming out of direct provision, you can go to the social clubs where they set up, youth clubs, schools. That's what you do. That's what a casting director does. When I cast The Butcher Boy back all those years ago, it was about going to every national school in the north of Ireland and counties like Cavan and Monaghan to find that boy. You're not going to find them in an agency. You're not going to find them. They're not there yet. I'm hoping they will be eventually, at least the talented ones. But right now, my job of work is to go into those communities and to go directly into them. And the same with forecasting travellers, like Carmel and I did. I work with travellers now quite a bit, as does Carmel. Again, the travelling community never feel they deserve to be at this table of casting, and they just don't think it's something that they would be acknowledged at. And so we fight all of those things. We have to go out. We have to go out and sit with them.
So you have to be proactive.
You have to go out and sit with them. You have to talk to them. You have to get them in and do a workshop with them. You have to engage. if we want that level
And
of
you need to be
authenticity.
invested though to do that, don't you?
Yeah.
Because that requires work.
Oh, yeah.
You
extra work.
offered people actual actor training as well, completely free.
Yeah.
There's a load of steps between where you are and where you want to get to.
Yeah.
And one project can't go the whole distance.
No.
But within the model, and it goes back to that particular model, I could go I could cast, I could make a film with only travelers in the morning if I don't have a pre-existing industrial model. And if I don't have a pre-existing script that's built for that model. I could do it in a heartbeat. I know how I do it. And it's how I used to make queer theatre. I used to work with completely non-actors. We made brilliant theatre because we didn't have a model that pre-existed the people. And then you can make awesome work. You build a model from what's actually there on the ground.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think casting directors like me have to, it's not like, it's a bit like not having the industrial model, is that like for the summer I'm going to be doing 8 workshops with Mary McDonough, who's a traveller who's set up acting workshops for travellers. I will just do those because it really benefits me. Benefits me because in 2 months' time or 8 months' time or a year's time, someone's going to come to me with a script and it's going to require some travellers and I'm going to know who they are because I've already done the work. So often I do the work not because I'm doing something right now, it's because I want to do the work. I want to know who's out there. I want to see who's potentially, like John Connors, for instance, is a classic case of a genius actor. He was such a find for Love Hate for me. Such a find. He will cross the line. He won't always play traveller roles. I think he's actually recently been cast in The Abbey in a really great role that I can't talk about because I don't know if he's signed up yet. But they've started to we've all started to cast John outside of the fact that he's become some sort of spokesperson for the travelling community. Again, a community that's very hard to get across the line because culturally they do not feel welcome at our table. And we struggle with that all the time. People like me struggle with it, but there's probably quite a good reason for it.
Anybody else? We done? Okay, we done? Okay, just to say then, I didn't know that I could say about the IFI board, but can I just say to Ross, thank you. It's always a joy to be back in the IFI, and I'm extremely proud, as you both know, to join the IFI board, but I thought I couldn't say anything for a while, and that's why I've been so silent, Ross. Thank you all. It's wonderful to be in your company again. I'd like to thank Maureen Hughes. Thank you very much. Carmel, Aisha Boulaji, I'm close enough, and Clyde Nawanka. It's been a pleasure, guys. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you very much indeed for your attention, for being here.